Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us on this final night of COP. It's been a long journey.
Maybe too soon.
My name is Sephora Berman. I'm the International Program Director at Stand.Earth, and I'm also the chair of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative. Really appreciate you joining us this evening after such a long journey here at COP26. I think it's really important at this moment to discuss both what's happening right now tonight at COP, what we've achieved so far, because this COP has felt in some ways like a turning point for those of us who work on fossil fuel supply and production issues. For the first time, maybe in 30 years, we're actually starting to have a conversation about why coal, oil, and gas are not included in our international climate agreements. The media are actually starting to pay attention to the hypocrisy of wealthy nations, especially committing to not fund fossil fuel production overseas, which I think is one of the big moments that we saw here at COP, and it's a tremendous achievement. 25 nations committing to not continue overseas financing of fossil fuel production, yet still financing fossil fuel production and approving fossil fuel production and new projects at home. So part of what we are here to discuss tonight is, what does it mean to say the world needs to stop fossil fuel production expansion and wind it down? How do we actually do that? When we talk about international cooperation in order to achieve that, what does that mean? What does it mean to talk about a global just transition versus just a just transition? How do we ensure that equity and justice are at the core of any new mechanisms, principles, discussions, and negotiations to wind down the production of fossil fuels? So I think everyone here knows the science is now very clear. We can no longer do any expansion of oil, gas, and coal if we're to remain under 1.5 degrees Celsius. Civil society, Indigenous leaders have known this for a long time and have been fighting projects in their homes and marching in the streets now for over a decade, and for many Indigenous nations for a lot longer than that, to keep it in the ground. But this year we finally had both the IPCC, the IEA, and of course the UN Production Gap Report acknowledging that we need to stop expansion of not only emissions, but production. So how did we get here? How did we end up in 30 years of climate change negotiations and still only just having a conversation now about winding down production? In part, it's because that the theory of climate policy was that the market would constrain production. That's not working, not fast enough to keep us safe. And we'll talk a little bit about that tonight. Why isn't it working? What's going on with subsidies and tax breaks? But I think the premise, one of the premises of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative, is that we can't allow the markets to decide the fate of humanity. That at this moment in history, our governments are called to ensure a wind down of both production and emissions. So thank you so much for joining us tonight for this really important conversation. I'm really excited that we have a tremendous panel here tonight to discuss the issue with us. But before I introduce them, I want to acknowledge that we also have a panel that is predominantly white and predominantly entirely North. That's because of the larger, it's a reflection and a result of the vaccine, apartheid, and the fact that this is the most exclusive COP and that we have ever had. And much of the world is not here, especially people from the Global South. So the people who are here from the Global South are very thin on the ground and in high demand. This panel, we were supposed to have Tasneem Essop, Mitzi Janelle Tam, and also Harjit Singh. All three are still at COP fighting the good fight on loss and damages, and that's where they need to be. So we wish them well. We will do our best to address some of the issues of equity and justice here on this panel tonight. All right. Yes, it's been a long COP. Here we go. Everybody ready? So with us this evening, we have Ariel Deranje to my left. Ariel is a Dene Suline woman, member of the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nations and founder and executive director of Indigenous Climate Action, based in Alberta, Canada. And worthy of hoots, yes. Carol Muffett is president of the Center for International Environmental Law, a nonprofit organization that uses the power of law to protect an environment, promote human rights, and ensure a just and sustainable society. Mark Campanella, who many of you know, was just on the last panel, is the founder and executive chairman of the Carbon Tracker Initiative and conceived the unburnable carbon capital markets thesis. Prior to this, Mark spent several decades working for major institutional asset management companies. And finally, Alex Rafalowitz. Alex is the director of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative. And before that, one of the directors of 350.org, and also one of the founders of the global campaign to demand climate justice.
I was at the founding.
Okay, great. Okay, so let's get started. So Ariel, earlier today in a press conference, we talked about what's holding us back from the just transition. And you specifically talked about some of the connections between decarbonization, decolonization, capital markets, and capitalism. And I was astounded how you brought everything together so clearly. You know, I'd just like to give you the opportunity to tell us a little bit about what you've been experiencing at COP, how you see the connections on these issues, and we'll take it from there.
Thank you. So, Masicho, Eklanete, Dene Sotlaneta, Ariel Ekwe Hushe, Deranje Betsini Hesli. My name is Ariel Ekwe Deranje. I just introduced myself in my traditional language, which is Dene or Dene Sotlane. And I just like to introduce my name. My name, Ariel Ekwe, means Thunder Woman in my language. And I think it's important that I actually share this story because my uncle, who was a medicine person, he passed away in the last year during the pandemic, but he said that my name was one that was given to me on purpose because the thunder is the sound that carries from the lightning. You don't always see the lightning, but you can always hear the sound from far away. And that is my responsibility to be the voice of my people. So given that, I often end up in spaces like this, like a COP. And I also want to say, I don't remember what I said this morning because it feels like it was 2 days ago. But I'll do my best.
Totally
I'll do my best to remember what I said. But my experiences in the COP so far in bringing in those pieces and those elements of decolonization and what's needed to move towards phasing out of fossil fuels and just transition, and all of this together in one articulation, just a little task. So I'll do my best there as well. But my experiences of the COP so far, absolutely, this is one of the most exclusive COPs I've ever been to. And despite the fact that it's so exclusive, Indigenous peoples have shown up in numbers that we've never seen as well. The scariest thing to counter that stat is that for every Indigenous representative that has made it here despite the odds, both economic and for the public health pandemic and the restrictions that are required, meaning that there are people that had to come 10 days before the COP started so that they could quarantine because they were not given access either to the vaccine or their country is on a red listed country. And those people made not only the monetary sacrifices, but the time sacrifices to come here from the front lines of their communities where, as Indigenous peoples, we experience climate change worst and first. And so these people had to take huge sacrifices. I myself had to make huge sacrifices to come to be away from my family. And yet this space, this COP in particular, giving out tickets to attend certain sessions, Indigenous people still being sidelined from negotiations, we still showed up in numbers never seen before. And on the counter to that, for every Indigenous person, there were 2 oil and gas lobbyists. We know who this space was created for. It was created for oil and gas lobbyists because the COPs have become a place where we are talking about trade agreements that are going to allow these capitalist economies to continue, to proliferate not only at the lands and territories of Indigenous communities and the communities that are represented here, challenging those very structures, but this is a space where countries and parties are buying into the greenwashing and false solutions that are being negotiated in those hallways, where as our delegation of Indigenous peoples in the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change, we have been advocating and fighting relentlessly for 30 years within the COP spaces to ensure that our rights as Indigenous peoples, alongside all rights, human rights, are not just given lip service in these spaces, but that they are operationalized and that they are protected within the discourse that's happening in those spaces. So that when those false solutions get forward, that there is a lever to pull. That within Article 6, we include human rights and the rights of Indigenous peoples. We're right now advocating and trying really hard in these last hours. A group of my people have been texting me saying that they're still trying to ensure that free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples is included, that within the mechanisms that Indigenous peoples are included alongside civil society and the private sector. The private sector is getting named in the mechanisms for negotiating a global carbon market, but the participation of Indigenous peoples has been left out. This is so shameful. This is so shameful that we have to fight that hard, and yet we have to do it on the sidelines. Because on the counter to us being on the sidelines of these negotiations, our people are advancing some of the best solutions on the ground that are not reliant on fossil fuels. They are reliant on systems of relationships with the natural world that have allowed our people to protect 80% of the world's biodiversity. 80% of the world's biodiversity. And that biodiversity wasn't just protected and safeguarded as an externality. It was a space that was our medicine cabinet, that is our medicine cabinets, that is our fridge, that is our church, that is our education and school systems. We have whole economies centered around our relationships with the lands and the species, from the rivers and the oceans, to the grass, to the plants, to the trees, to the rocks, to the mountains, to every living being in those spaces. We build our economies and our systems around that. And those solutions look like language revitalization, cultural revitalization, that have been proven that when those things are intact, biodiversity thrives. The health and livelihoods of people thrives. We are no longer dependent on importing our food systems. Just to give you one more fact on this, Indigenous peoples, or in my community, before tar sands began, because I come from the area where we're extracting the Alberta tar sands, the largest industrial project and fossil fuel project on planet Earth, that in my territory before fossil fuels took off in the 1990s, we were 80% subsistence. 80% subsistence in a community that's flying only. And now we don't have that luxury. And now we're reliant on grocery stores where things have to be imported in. Imagine if we were able to return back to our traditional food systems. That would decrease our footprint. There are so many ways in which Indigenous lifeways and ways of being can help us decrease our reliance on fossil fuel and bring us to a place of harmony. But instead, we fight. And Indigenous resistance on the front line through civil disobedience and the assertion of our self-determination and our traditional governance systems has been criminalized and vilified, but it is also responsible for keeping 1.8 billion tons of carbon in the ground in North America alone. That was documented in a recent report called Indigenous Resistance Against Carbon by Indigenous Environmental Network, Oil Change International, and Indigenous Climate Action. Our communities are demanding that we not only phase out of fossil fuels, but that we work towards decolonizing the very systems that have allowed these industries to proliferate and be leading the negotiations in places like COP26. Thank you, Masicho.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ariel. And the Fossil Fuel Treaty emerged in part out of many of our shared experience in working with Indigenous leaders to stop projects, from new oil drilling in the heart of the Amazon in Ecuador to tar sands development and pipeline development, and realizing that there are all these communities across the world that are trying to stop these projects. But even when we have a so-called progressive government, our prime minister, my prime minister in Canada, after the Harper administration, Trudeau came to Paris and, with his hand on his heart, he said, Canada's back, and put in place some really good climate policy, a price on carbon, et cetera, but continued to approve more and more fossil fuel projects because under the Paris Agreement, of course, countries have to set targets, they have to constrain emissions, but they're not required to constrain production. We don't yet have any negotiations globally on who gets to produce and how much. And it was that disconnect that started a number of us talking about, well, what would it look like if there was international cooperation to actually address production? So we didn't have this lock-in. So we had a more managed decline instead of an unmanaged decline and stranded assets and a carbon bubble. So Alex, I'm going to go to you and ask you if you can explain some of the three pillars that we've been designing under the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, and what the treaty would do, what kind of missing framework it would provide to help us achieve the Paris Agreement.
Thanks, Sephora, and thanks, Ariel, as well for sharing, and I think grounding us in what this struggle really means for people across the world. And there are, of course, hundreds of millions of Indigenous peoples who live on this planet, and the fact that there are so few of them here in the COP is pretty representative of the way this COP has been structured. The Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty initiative takes its name from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty initiative. And we had a press conference on Thursday where leaders of young people from the Fridays for Future movement, from Bangladesh, from Scotland, from the Philippines, from Brazil, and from Malaysia, all were talking about how fossil fuels are their generation's nuclear weapons. Fossil fuels are the existential threat that faces this generation. And so the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty sets out to address that threat. And we adopted, for inspiration, the three pillars set out in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So the first pillar is that we need to end proliferation of fossil fuels. We need to end the expansion of the fossil fuel industry. This means that we need to set a global norm that there are no new licenses, no new permits, no new funding for any fossil fuel infrastructure going forward from today. And we know that that is an absolute requirement if we're going to meet the 1.5 degree goal. Now that's been set out even by the IEA's pathways, and the IEA's pathways, of course, includes a huge amount of future drawdown from technologies that don't yet exist, and so it likely underestimates the scale of the challenge we have ahead of us. And they've been clear, no new investments. So no new fossil fuels and the end of proliferation is a missing global norm. It's something we need more and more countries to step up and adopt. We've seen the first stage of that with the launch of the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance this week, which was a really historic moment to see, I think 11 nations are a part of the collective in terms of being core members, associate members, and friends, who have said they will end licensing of oil and gas. However, the timeframes that some of them are using are not really consistent with the goal that we would like to see. And so I think it's part of our effort is to try and get a universal agreement on that goal, and set that goal from today. The second pillar of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty is disarmament. So removing the stockpiles and the problem that we already have. Because not only do we need to end the expansion of this industry, but we need to reduce the amount of production currently globally by at least 6% per year, according to the UNEP's production gap report. So our current plans are to double the production of coal, oil, and gas, and what we actually need to do is reducing it by 6%. So that per year. So that means that we need to have a conversation about where and how we achieve a phase out of this production. And we believe that the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative could provide a framework for that negotiation, and to consider that in respect to what is equitable. A founding principle of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change has been to consider both the historical emissions, the relative capacities of different countries, and there would need to be a slightly different application of those principles when it comes to fossil fuel production, but those should guide us in thinking about how might we allocate responsibility for phasing out and timing across different countries and communities. And in fact, on the second day of the COP, a group of over 200 organizations from across the world, including the International Trade Union Confederation, WWF, Friends of the Earth, ActionAid, released a report called Fair Shares Phase Out, which started to articulate some of the principles that could be used to inform how we might begin to phase out production of coal, oil, and gas. And then the final pillar, although perhaps overall the most important pillar of the proposal is what we call the global just transition. So currently, the thinking around just transition has been very place-based, and that's incredibly important. A just transition is going to be guided in many places and communities by the vision and the interests of the workers involved, their unions, their broader community. However, we need to have a global conversation about a just transition, because there are whole economies that are to different degrees dependent on the fossil fuel system. They might be dependent on it for stabilization of their currency. They might be dependent on it for foreign debt repayment. They might be dependent on it for national income, for government income, which is then used to support social spending. And if we are going to transition off these fuels this decade, we need to have a global plan to ensure stability and improvement of people's lives in many of these places. And we'd like to see that we can look at a global agreement that works with countries to support them to diversify and grow their economy, that ensures that we actually achieve energy access and the right to energy for all, and that it supports the process and participation of peoples, and that's Indigenous peoples, that's unions, that's other community organizations that want to have a say about what their community looks like. And the current global sharing and practice on that is not sufficiently developed to confront the crisis that we face. So those are the three pillars of the proposed Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. I'm going to get in ahead in case there's a question. We don't have a treaty written up. What we have are those three principles to guide where we think the biggest gaps are in current international cooperation. And what we want to do is start the conversation about what needs to happen. And our hope is that over the coming years, we'll generate many different proposals under each of those pillars to help guide the global conversation to one that can, effectively start to drive the transformation of our societies and economies away from ones based on fossil fuels.
Thanks, Alex. So, Mark, when we first started talking about this several years ago, we looked pretty deeply at the nuclear non-proliferation model, and one of the things that was really clear was that you need accountability and transparency on what governments are producing, what is the stockpile. And I was pretty shocked to find out that there is no accountability and transparency right now on who's producing what and how much. So Mark chairs an initiative that was just publicly talked about here at COP for the first time, called the Global Registry of Fossil Fuel Production and Reserves. So can you tell us a little bit about what that is, why it's important, and how it relates to the treaty?
Yeah, no, thanks, Zipporah. Before I talk about that, I was reflecting on the remarks that Nicholas made on the previous panel, and afterwards where we talked that we made a wrong turn at the 1992 Earth Summit. Instead of focusing on fossil fuels and the production of fossil fuels, the decision was made at the time to focus on emissions. And so we've ended up in this cycle where we can't talk about fossil fuels as part of the negotiations here at the COP. It's quite remarkable because it's a way of distract the industry, the fossil fuel industry, throwing away attention from what they're actually doing. So as a consequence, if climate change isn't a question of dealing with fossil fuels, we don't need to know who is producing what, and we don't need to know where they're producing it or when they're producing it. So Carbon Tracker was set up in 2010, 2011, and we're probably best known for just taking those top 200 globally traded companies, coal, oil, and gas companies, now known as the Carbon Underground, and looking at the reserves and the resources and discovering that just those companies alone had enough to take us way beyond 3 degrees of warming. And we tried even then, right at the beginning, that 2013, we wrote to the Financial Stability Board. Now let's get this right. We wrote to the FSB, the Financial, that's the one. Thank you. The Financial Accounting Standards Board, that's it. That's the one. Asking for listed companies to disclose the carbon dioxide that sat in their reserves and their resources. Mm-hmm. And we actually got it put to a vote of the Financial Accounting Standards Board in the US. And under the Obama administration, and we lost it 7-0. It would have been great if we'd lost it 5-2, 4-3. Lost it clearly 7. And what that was markets and financial regulators saying, oh, this CO2 thing, none of this really counts. None of this is really of interest to regulators or markets. And in the last 10 years, since the Copenhagen Agreement, there's been 2,500 initial public offerings and secondary share offerings of fossil fuel companies around the world, raising nearly $700 billion of pension fund money and trillions of dollars of debt on top of that as well. And it continues. And I was been commenting here at the COP that there was a coal IPO on the London market just the other week. And this continues, and this continues. And so the Global Registry of Fossil Fuels, which is set up independently, is trying to answer the question of who is producing what, where, and when. And it's not just a registry of the names, it's a registry of the locations and the corporates. It's a registry of the embedded carbon dioxide. So think of it as we'll be for the first time able to add up the carbon dioxide that sits in the reserves of these coal companies and these oil companies, and we'll be able to test the development plans of these companies and these governments against the Paris goals. As we said right at the beginning of Carbon Tracker, if we can't burn what we've already financed, why are we raising more money and issuing new licenses to expand it any further? Mm-hmm. It's collective suicide, which is why the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty addressing that is so important. And in the op-ed I wrote for the Financial Times earlier this year, I talked about this beggar your neighbor type approach that exists, where one country says, if we don't produce, another company will produce. And I think you were there, Zipporah. I went to Vancouver to hear Premier Trudeau talk at the Globe conference, where you were debating some oil and gas executives. And he said, we're a very responsible nation that supports climate goals, so we will responsibly develop our oil sands. And this is a story I've told before. And then because I was doing a lot of travel that year, I went to Norway, and the Norwegian Prime Minister was speaking on a podium, and I spoke afterwards, and I could hear she said, Norway, sit behind the Paris goals. We are a responsible nation, and we will responsibly develop all of Norway's oil and gas reserves in the Arctic. And then to crown off that rather miserable year, I went to Argentina to debate the Bank of Argentina on the financing of Cuarto Norte, which is the oil and gas. And they said, yeah, Argentina is completely behind these climate goals, and we will responsibly develop all of our shale oil. And so what we've got is this idea that countries will fight each other for the last rights to produce every barrel of oil and ton of coal. So the registry is an attempt to map this, who is doing this, and it will be publicly accessible, it will be searchable, civil society will be able to use it. It will be policy neutral. We're not saying to people, do this or do that, but you'll be able to see what governments will do. So each time governments issue a new oil and gas licensing round, if this works, and there's a lot of data involved and a lot of analysis, we'll be able to calculate the embedded carbon dioxide in each new oil and gas reserve issued, and then we can create a champions table. Who issued the most licenses with the most CO2? And then we'll be able to, then civil society and others and parliamentarians will be able to call this out for what it is. So we don't quite have a website like the wonderful fossilfueltreaty.org, but we're ambitious for what we want to do in 2022.
Fantastic. Thanks, Mark. So I'm going to go to you, Carol, because and then I'm going to open it up for questions. We're going to have some time for you to ask questions about either the Global Registry, the Fossil Fuel Treaty, or also this panel. Can definitely comment on what's happening right now here at COP as it relates to fossil fuels. So get your questions ready. But Carol, so you've been involved in the Fossil Fuel Treaty from the very beginning. We've been thinking a lot about what does international cooperation mean? What are the barriers to stopping fossil fuel expansion? And what are some of the mechanisms? What are some of the areas that the treaty and principles would have to address under a treaty? So can you give people a window into some of those areas, some of those barriers that we've been talking about, and what a treaty would actually do?
Yeah, I think we've seen one of the most important barriers to international cooperation all around us the last 2 weeks, and that is the fossil fuel industry pervades the international system. And it exercises extraordinary influence over governments, not only here, but in capitals around the world. And so the question becomes, how can we respond to a global crisis? How can we respond to a shared crisis when the governance systems we've been relying on are so infused with fossil fuel lobbyists and fossil fuel money? And I think this is where the model of the Fossil Fuel Treaty becomes really powerful. We started tonight talking about nuclear nonproliferation, and nuclear nonproliferation, it was much more than a treaty. What made nuclear nonproliferation work was that people were in the streets demanding it. That not only were people demanding it, but states, cities, even individual neighborhoods came to declare this is a nuclear-free zone. We have a landmine ban treaty, despite the fact that many countries, many very powerful countries, didn't want a landmine ban treaty because a small number of states said, you may not want it, but the world needs it, and we are going to do it. And they said, you can stay over there with your consensus process. We are moving forward, and we are asking who wants to join us? And the answer on the landmine ban treaty, as with the nuclear nonproliferation treaty, was virtually everyone in the world, when those barriers to real action were removed, wanted to be part of it. And so I think that is what we are looking for, is a treaty, is a model that allows those who are willing to move farther, faster, the room to do precisely that. So what are the mechanisms for doing that? I think one of the powerful things about a fossil fuel nonproliferation treaty is that there are multiple entry points to it. for countries around the world who engage with fossil fuels, who are trapped into the fossil system in very, very different ways. What unites them is those common principles, the urgent need to stop expansion, the urgent need to begin a managed decline, and the fundamental responsibility to make that decline a just one, a just transition. So I think when we look at the models for doing this, I think one of the really powerful things about the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty is it allows us to address many of the things that are wrong with this UN system, like the fact that every time countries propose to take measures to phase out fossil fuels, they get threatened with an investment dispute or trade sanctions by some other country. A fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty could turn that on its head. A fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty could actually say, we're going to ensure there's a just transition because the countries in this pact are going to prioritize Nigeria and Indonesia and the most vulnerable oil-dependent countries in buying the remaining oil that we need. The countries in this pact are going to commit to first to phasing out foreign subsidies, then much more importantly phasing out their own subsidies, then stopping leasing and of their own lands, then stopping permitting. There are multiple ways that this treaty could be implemented. And one question I get a lot is, well, what do you do with the fact that the United States and Saudi Arabia would never join a treaty like this? And here's what I have to say, and I will say in advance that ZEP has not endorsed this. This is not a treaty idea. This is me. The U.S. has, for decades, led the penalizing of state sponsors of terrorism, often unilaterally, often with extraordinary draconian measures. All the while, our country, the United States, has been, together with Saudi Arabia, with Russia, a state sponsor of global warming, a state sponsor of climate change, and the impacts of that are mounting. A fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty could provide a vehicle for those countries who are tired of that sort of state-sponsored climate change, that sort of state-sponsored climate emergency, to say, we are standing up and we are fighting back and we're going to hold you accountable.
Wow, fantastic. Actually, I'm going to bring one other voice in. I realized it's that we also have a virtual speaker tonight who couldn't make it in person. Many of you, of course, know Jodie Williams, who received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1997 for her work to ban landmines through the International Campaign to Ban Landmines, which shared the Peace Prize with her that year. At that time, she became the 10th woman and the 3rd American woman in its almost 100-year history to receive the prize. Jodie could not come to COP, but she recorded this short video for tonight's event. And if you're ready, I'd like to show it now.
Welcome to the event at COP in Glasgow. We have with us today Jodie Williams.
Hi, I wish I were there in person. In fact, my grandmother was born in Glasgow. Next time. I wanted to just make a few comments about why the Nobel Women's Initiative signed an open letter calling for and in support of a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. From my personal experience with the landmine campaign, it's critical to set a new norm, a new standard, in order to be able to put pressure on countries that are not moving forward quickly enough for all of us, and all living beings will feel the pressure to do the right thing finally. Sometimes people think international treaties are meaningless, but that is not our experience in landmines, in cluster bombs. Treaties matter, especially when civil society is a vital part of creating them and pressuring countries to carry them out. Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome to our event at COP. We're pleased to have Jodie Williams here with us today.
Hi, everybody. I wish I were there in Glasgow.
She's so good we can hear her twice. Liz Bernstein, who you just saw there briefly, is one of the organizers with the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative, and organized with the Nobel Women Laureates to reach out to Nobel laureates from around the world and discuss the Fossil Fuel Treaty with them. As a result, the Nobel laureates, 101 Nobel laureates, including the Dalai Lama, endorsed the principles of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty and sent a letter to the Biden summit earlier this year. That was just one of the pieces of momentum that we've had this year. The Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative we've only been public now 1 year. And in that year, we've had 101 Nobel laureates. We've now had 2,500 scientists and academics endorse the treaty. Yesterday, we had youth leaders, Fridays for the Future groups from around the world, announce their campaign and calling on governments to negotiate a treaty. And the day before that, 150 members of parliament from 31 countries, so elected officials from 31 countries, in a letter that was created by elected officials from the Global South. They have their own distinct website. They're encouraging members of parliament from around the world to join them. And it's called Fossil Free Future. Is that right? fossilfreefuture.org. So I'm going to just turn to you now to take some of your questions for our panel. We're not going to keep it running long. I know you'd like to get to some of the wine and food. It has been a long several months, 2 weeks here at COP. But I would like to give you the opportunity while we have this panel up here. So is there anyone who has some questions from the floor, on the registry, or on the treaty? Do we have a microphone? There's a mic there. Got one at the back.
Okay, I'll ask a question. Hopefully this is not too naive. My name is Barbara Davis, and I work at Carbon Tracker.
Yeah, close to your...
Sounds very okay, here we go. So thank you first for the panel and what you've said. I think that they're very powerful words and resonate quite strongly with me. Throughout this COP and today, we've heard a lot about what we need to do and the conversations we need to have, and now we need to start doing this and start doing that. And I remember my father told me in the 60s they needed to start doing that. So what I want to ask, and of course we still need to ensure a just transition. And there was also talk about a tipping point. Do you think we finally reached the tipping point that we're actually going to do? And I know you're doing this today, and thank you, but have we all reached the tipping point? Have these countries reached the tipping point finally?
Who would like to start?
Well, we know Wales has. No, I think BOGO is really, has marked a line in the sand. It's had a lot of attention. And there was that fight to get into the press room yesterday. Quite unbelievable.
So Mark, just back up into the BOGA, Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, in case anyone wasn't there yesterday. So we now have 11 countries, 9 countries, 2 subnationals who have joined the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, committing to end exploration of oil and gas. And it was a crush. It definitely felt like a history moment, didn't it, in that moment?
No, it did. And I think I'm right in saying that Jeremy Vine of Channel 5, a popular TV show around mid-morning, not aimed at Financial Times readers, by the way. It was one of those chat shows, was talking about the treaty just today. So there's been a change in awareness, and in my view, we always have to reach for those pivotal moments, and we're hearing that there's a real battle for the inclusion of fossil fuels in the communique that comes at the end. Really, for the first time, it's included. We know that it refers to ending coal, and there's a reference to ending fossil fuel subsidies, and there's a bit of a battle as to whether it will actually go in the end. But to get to this far, I think it's great. To have nations permanently give up oil and gas licensing rounds is great. But we're really at the beginning, or the end of the beginning, and the real battle, I think, is still ahead of us.
Thanks. I'm just going to, Ariel, would you like to?
Yeah, I also agree. I was going to bring mention to the language that we're seeing. It's not phase out of all fossil fuels, but the fact that this is being mentioned is an indicator that we're moving this way. And coming from so-called Canada, where we have a government that purchased an oil and gas pipeline. Like, I don't understand why, spending billions of dollars of public funds for an oil and gas pipeline, made an announcement early on that they were going to put a cap on oil and gas by 2030. So we're seeing this. It does feel like it's a little too late sometimes, but the reality is that this conversation is very topical. It's not just topical for oil-rich nations like Canada and the United States, but it's topical for all nations that are seeing the impacts that fossil fuels have had. And that I know that in Madrid and in every other COP that I've attended over the last 12 years, they didn't even want to mention fossil fuels. So we're moving towards real discourse on what it means to phase out of fossil fuels and what it means to have a just transition as part of it, because I think that's been the biggest barrier for a lot of countries. It's like, but we're dependent on it for our economies. How do we move forward? And this is what I always do. I have to throw in a plug for Indigenous peoples within that discourse, because when we talk about just transition, we always talk about the labor force and the just transition of the workers, which is critical, and for the communities that are reliant on oil and gas. But how do we have the conversations about the just transition, including the support for those communities that have been fighting back against those things and that have been trying to advance their ways of being in contrast to these economies? Because we have been force-fed that fossil fuels are the only answer for so long. Our communities have been told, my community specifically, I will speak to my experience, my community in the tar sands was told, we just have to figure out how much money we will accept in order to allow the tar sands to continue to expand. We were told that there is no way we will ever stop a project. And I can tell you, in the history of my community, we were never able to fully stop a single project despite legal interventions in the environmental review process. We delayed, and we created such a financial loss to companies that they pulled out. But did the government actually say no to a single permit? Never. This is why we need this. This is where we hold governments accountable, because the people are saying this is what we need, and we're hearing it now in the hallways of international climate negotiations. And it's topical and it's necessary, and we're getting there, but we have to do so much more work.
Woo. Oh, moderators aren't supposed to whoop, are we? That was the bad.
I'll whoop
It's
for
been
you.
a long COP. This is why we're so excited that Indigenous Climate Action has joined us in the Fossil Fuel Treaty this week, and also COICA, Federation of All Indigenous Nations in the Amazon, and the Indigenous Environmental Network have joined as partners in the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty as well, which is super exciting. Carol, I think you also wanted to address this question.
Yeah, and I wanted to start with a simple answer. The answer is yes. You just don't see it here. The truth is, we are well past that tipping point, and we're gaining extraordinary momentum. On a single day last May, you had Shell lose a massive court case in the Netherlands, and then turn around and see 2 US-based oil majors lose in their own annual general meetings. And both of those moments happened just a week after the IEA, which always puts the rosiest possible spin on the outlook for fossil fuels, acknowledged that we can't go on expanding fossil fuels. More than $30 trillion has been divested. The announcements that you've seen this week, they are extraordinary announcements, and they come on the heels of a year, 2 years, where we've seen a barrage of milestones like that. The industry is facing litigation across Europe, across the United States, in countries around the world. We are gaining momentum. We are starting to win. But the industry is fighting back not only here in what is ironically one of its last real holdouts, but it's fighting back by pushing the world to use the same products in a new form in plastics, by pushing the world to build a reliance on false solutions like carbon capture and storage and blue hydrogen, which are the same problem in a new form. So are we gaining momentum? Have we passed that tipping point? Yes, but we have to constantly adapt because the industry is constantly adapting.
Good question. Our whole panel wants to address it. Alex.
Yeah, I agree broadly with the panel. I disagree with Carol right at the end, because we did see something in those holes that I actually think is remarkable and want to remark on it. And it was the original draft cover decision included that we needed to phase out coal. And in the negotiations, India made an intervention speaking for the basic group, Brazil, India, China, and South Africa, and said, it's on the record, we don't only need to phase out coal, we need to phase out coal, oil, and gas. We need to do it in the context of equity, with developed countries taking the lead, developing countries having their fair share of carbon space, India's analysis about some of the challenges of equity internationally. And of course, the United States came in and said, well, we can't have any language around operationalizing equity in the operational paragraphs, so we're going to have to take this offline. And who knows where the end result was, but the text that came out after that does not include oil or gas. But the point being that India's response demonstrates it is aware that we need to phase out coal, oil, or gas. In the halls of the United Nations, nations are clearly saying this. We haven't yet got to the stage where they're making the commitments that are aligned with it. We haven't yet got to the stage where we're having focused negotiations on that question, but the knowledge is there, it's apparent, and for me that is a significant indication that we are at a tipping point.
Thanks, Alex. And I saw a question over here.
Thank you. My name's Deepak. I co-run an organization called Biofuel Watch. I wanted to slightly respond to the idea of the tipping point on the Fossil Fuel Proliferation Treaty. I think it's absolutely right. I think consciousness has really moved on, and we really are getting to a point where corporations themselves are thinking just how long can we carry on with this scam? Now, the challenge is, on the other side, is that the slack is being picked up by false solutions. And one of the most egregious false solutions that I can see is the rush to bioenergy. Right now, we have Drax Power Station in England, which is burning the equivalent of 25 million trees a year. And of course, it can't use softwood because it has too low an energy density, so it uses hardwood, which comes from natural forests. So it's busy deforesting some of our most biodiverse temperate forests in North and South Carolina, the biodiverse forests in Eastern Europe, the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia. And we're seeing now other organizations, energy companies, driving a rush to bioenergy with huge implications that are unspoken of, largely unspoken of. In Europe, we're calling bioenergy renewable energy. Would you believe that under the European Renewable Energy Directive, 50%, in fact it's slightly over 50% of all our energy comes from bioenergy? In other words, from trashing natural ecosystems. And when we trash ecosystems, it's our last buffer against catastrophic climate change. Forests are what holds it all together. They drive the biospheric cycles. They hold our life support systems together. They drive the nutrient cycle, the rainfall cycle, the carbon cycle. So it's incredible. We've run a COP here for 2 weeks. It's hardly spoken of. In fact, I can't think of a single time in a plenary where that was mentioned. So we've got this rush to false solutions. As I say, the most egregious one is bioenergy, and it's being sanctioned, supported. So my challenge is, and the question I'd like to ask is, how aware is the panel that success there is driving as big or a bigger problem to do with biodiversity collapse and collapse of our life support systems? So success in one part is causing destruction in another. And to me,
it's a really good point.
So let me pass that to you.
Thank you so much. That's an incredibly important intervention. One of the pieces of research that we're doing with our allies is looking at biodiversity loss and hotspots around the world and overlaying extraction, fossil fuel extraction, to understand where where are we having the double impact with fossil fuel extraction and biodiversity loss. So that's a very interesting piece of research that will come out next year as well. I'm also the International Program Director at Stand.Earth, and we also are working on this issue of false solutions, especially as it relates to biomass, because the industry is growing and the Drax facility itself is being fed by biomass from Canada. Our research is showing that that is not wood waste. In fact, we put a drone up above their factories and found out that it's whole trees into those facilities, and then trace the supply chain, and those whole trees are actually coming from old growth and primary forests in British Columbia, and then being called a solution. So stand with you on that one. I have a suspicion that a lot of people on our panel would like to talk about false solutions, and I'm going to open up that conversation into being our last discussion point. You may want to discuss Article 6 for those in the room, net zero, CCS. Carol, you have a tremendous report that came out this year on CCS. So last comments, and then we're all going to need a drink. So on false solutions, loopholes, and again, how that might relate to the work under the treaty. I'll start with you, Ariel.
I'm gonna keep it as short and concise as possible. The problem is, this is a good treaty. The idea of phasing out, getting rid of fossil fuels is necessary. But what is fundamentally necessary beyond that is a systemic change that is not locking us into predatory capitalism. The root causes of climate change, yes, fossil fuels are one of them, but where does that come from? It comes from systems of colonialism, capitalism, extractivism, and systems of white supremacy that are predicated around hyper-individuality, the accumulation of wealth and notoriety. When we start to break down those systems and move towards decolonization, we can unlock ourselves from all the suites of false solutions that are being negotiated as trade agreements, as opposed to solutions to right our relationship with each other and the natural world. If we are able to do that, we won't be looking at false solutions, whether they're bioenergy, whether they're carbon market mechanisms, conservation offsets, nature-based solutions, or all of the solutions that are coming out that are just allowing multinational corporations to make profits off of the loss of ecosystems, the loss of human life, and the loss of all living beings on this planet. That's where we need to go. But this is a tool in the tool shed. If we don't do this, then there is less things to put the stick in the spoke of the wheel that just keeps on spinning.
Wow, fantastic. Ariel. Kel?
Yeah. I mean, I couldn't agree with you more with one modest tweak, and it is this. If you look at the business models and you look at the climate plans of ExxonMobil and Chevron and Shell, every one of them tells this fantasy story that the way their businesses are going to be climate compliant and still profitable is through the magic of false solutions, of which BECCS is the biggest one. And so we are all fighting the same fight because BECCS is one of the biggest stories the industry is telling about how you go on pumping oil and gas and somehow magically make the emissions disappear. In the lead up to this COP, nearly 800 organizations came together on a joint statement demanding real solutions from this COP and rejecting the idea of net zero based on carbon capture and storage, based on direct air capture, based on BECCS. And so absolutely, we are these, I think one of the exciting things is we see those movements coming together, recognizing that it's a shared fight. And when you do that, you have more leaders, you have more voices, and you have more power, and we need all we can get.
Mark.
I mean, it's been said before, and I'm not the first to say it, but our generation is the first in human history to be able to heat ourselves, cook for ourselves, and transport ourselves without actually burning something. We'll be able to use electrons. The days of the Neanderthals where we lit a fire to cook, those days are over. And the coming generation, this generation, the next generation, will be able to do all of that with electrification and with alternative solutions. So we don't need to put stuff into a power station and burn it. So, but the good news is, and you'll see this from Carbon Tracker's analysis, is in most parts of the world, renewables are now cheaper than new build coal-fired power and even new build gas, and in many places, operational gas. It's cheaper to close down coal-fired power and build a clean energy system. So that's terrific news. The problem that we're facing is that the system of industrialization and the fossil fuel-based system around which industry is built is deeply entrenched in our political system and in our financial system. And the role of groups that we have here today, whether we're a think tank like ourselves or advocacy group or Face First Nations group, is to really work hard in disrupting that power base. And for me, the exciting, well, of course we have the Exxon thing, but the exciting thing now, we've got Dan Loeb, who's a red-blooded capitalist in tooth and claw, taking on Shell by buying nearly $1 billion worth of Shell stock so as to split the company and create a renewable energy business or a hydrogen business and to close down the fossil fuel part of their business. Right now, I think in the boardrooms of every major fossil fuel company that's listed on the stock market, they're going through exactly the same thought process. And that's come through really the activism and the voices of a lot of people who've been working on this for as many years as Stand on Earth and SEAL and others have been doing.
Thanks, Mark. Alex, did you have any?
Yeah, so the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative is a civil society initiative. We have over 900 organizations that have endorsed, and your organization, if it hasn't, is welcome to join. And we try to support those organizations to engage in activism, campaigning, communications around this idea in their context as it makes sense. And the third pillar that we talked about, the just transition, we convened workshops for the endorsing organizations to discuss what are the parts of the just transition that you need to see. And this question came up. How do we make sure that our transition to alternative energy systems isn't a transition to some sort of replication of the current structure that we have today, isn't one that ignores the fact that 1 billion people don't have energy today, or isn't one that feeds the unsustainable, dangerous, and damaging extraction of resources from nature, whether that be biomass or whether that also be around the extraction of minerals that are required for the production of renewable energy technologies as well. And that the jobs in those sectors are good, well-covered, well-paid jobs with good conditions and safety. So there is a whole question, I think, for us to engage in around designing that alternative system as we build it. And we're incredibly fortunate in that the technology that Mark's just spoken about allows for a change in the structure of energy and power in our society. We do not need to have centralized, huge, capital-intensive, one place powering hundreds of thousands of activities anymore. We can distribute and democratize the generation of power and electricity, and that is going to be an incredibly exciting and liberating thing happening this decade. And so we see ourselves as also playing a role in contributing to that debate and trying to create that world and bring it into being, and I'd encourage you to join us.
Fantastic. Thank you, Alex. So for those who are new to the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative, we are developing campaigns and communications initiatives around the world with our partner organizations from around the world. We're also developing research initiatives to address and look at some of these barriers, some of these issues, debt forgiveness, trade, liability, et cetera, with universities and academics from around the world. So if you're interested, I hope you'll contact us. The research initiative is also looking at the third pillar on what does a global just transition mean, and what is our contribution then through the treaty to the just transition conversation. And then also a political diplomacy initiative where we're starting to talk to countries about the treaty. We know that this is a bold new idea, but at this moment in history, we need some bold new ideas. Some of the criticism we get is that big producers will never join. But what we've learned from studying other treaties, and you heard Jodie talking about the landmine treaty, about the nuclear non-proliferation treaty, is that the journey matters. Just proposing a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty over the last year has led to increased ambition, has led to new conversations. We're also told that we don't have time, that we don't have time for a treaty, but we offer that we don't have time for more of the same. Thank you for joining us here this evening to have this conversation. We hope you will join us at fossilfueltreaty.org. Thank you.